job of ensuring that the Global South and public institutions like the NHS get a fairer share of the kind of data value pie. But the policy space for these alternatives risks being shrunk down by digital trade rules in upcoming trade deals. So this webinar is really to explore this world of data and the value that's created within it. And it asks what kind of trade policy we're going to need to support the fair sharing of that data value. So at the trade justice movement, we're always interested in what trade deals and trade rules say and how they have an impact on the real world. So trade law is notoriously complicated and vague, but I'm going to run through 5 of those digital trade rules that we think are the most relevant and the most worrying for economic justice. So first of all, mandatory cross-border data flows. So the text here in italics is from the US, Mexico, Canada trade deal, which is one of the most advanced, if you like, trade deals on digital. So the provisions are the most far-reaching of any deal that we've had so far, more or less. This rule on cross-border data flow aims to ensure that companies can move personal data about you and me, freely and immediately across borders without any restriction. So this, in some ways, could be key for letting companies operate efficiently, but more cynically, unregulated data flows can be important to allow platforms to expand at low cost and to enter markets all over the world. So this is really a market access rule as well as a kind of efficiency one. Ultimately, data is a raw material of the digital economy, and control over it is a lucrative business. So just as some actors will be advantaged by free data flows, some others, including countries of the Global South, public service providers and working people, risk potentially losing out. The other side of the free data flow coin is a ban on keeping data local, basically. So these are kind of 2 parts of the same issue. So governments can't insist that certain kinds of data, or indeed all data, be kept on servers and processed within the country where it originates. So this ban is presented as an efficiency measure, because it would get expensive if companies had to process, you know, all their UK data in the UK or all their French data in France and so on. But really, no one is usually calling for all data to be kept local. Although, you know, in some cases, and especially perhaps for developing countries, that could be useful for keeping digital jobs and revenues local and supporting that kind of digital industrialization. But more commonly, this localization is based on a case-by-case analysis of where is there real public benefit to keeping this data local. And so it can be important for data security, like for health data and other very sensitive kinds of data. And it also might be necessary in the future as we develop these more collective models of data ownership. Localization might be necessary to facilitate those developments. The third rule isn't actually in the digital trade chapters of trade deals, it's in the wider trade deals, but it's very relevant to digital. So there is often in trade deals a rule that companies don't have to have a local branch in the country in order to trade across the border into the country. Now, this wasn't terribly relevant until the advent of the internet, because it was difficult to do trade across borders without having a local branch, just for practical reasons. But with the internet now, I could study an entire degree program, for instance, in another country without them having any presence in my country, and I could even work for an employer based in another country. So this has justice implications for several reasons. If there's no local company, it's who do I take to court if they're not paying me a fair minimum wage? How do I enforce safety regulations or sustainability regulations? It's also difficult to ensure they pay a fair share of tax. And in terms of data wealth and data value, which we're talking about today, it can complicate efforts to understand where that value is generated. And so if we're trying to return a fair share of the value back to citizens or workers that originate it, those efforts are complicated. The fourth rule is about source code and algorithm secrecy. So source code and algorithms are the basic coding that tell computer programs, apps, smart goods, and other digital products how to function. And this digital trade rule enables technology companies to effectively keep this code in a black box where regulators will be blocked from asking to see what that code says. It's also a kind of intellectual property protection. It stops that intellectual property of the computer code being able to be shared even when there's social benefit. So access to this code might be needed to prevent fraud or ensure product safety and quality, and also to identify racial and gender discrimination, which has been increasingly a problem in things like artificial intelligence. And then transfer of this code could be particularly important for economic reasons. So to ensure the gains of digitalization are fairly shared, you sometimes would want the intellectual property to actually be handed over to the commons who created, the people who collectively created the data that enabled that product to be created. So number 5 is the tariff ban on digital products. So this is a rule that bans countries from charging tariffs on electronic transmissions, which is things like the streaming of movies or the sending of 3D printed designs, and also really big electronic services like the provision of cloud computing and social media platforms. So this rule is already in place. There's been a rolling moratorium at the WTO on these kinds of tariffs since 1998. But of course, in 1998, this was a very small proportion of trade, whereas now it's a very large proportion of trade. And countries are beginning to consider what they're losing by not charging tariffs on this, especially countries that rely on tariffs quite significantly for their revenues. UNCTAD has done some work to look at how much countries are losing by not charging these tariffs, and they found it hugely skewed. So developing countries, between them, are losing between 6.5 and 11.5 billion a year, whereas by comparison, high-income countries are losing 22 times less than that, so only 289 million a year. That's led to real resistance in some quarters, making this ban permanent. So there's your whistle-stop tour of digital trade rules. I hope that that was useful. These will be touched upon and expanded on in much more interesting ways by our speakers. So we're going to start with Parminder Singh, who is with IT for Change in, yes.
Sorry, loads of people joined after you did the introduction. I wonder if you just want to recap about the comments and questions.
Yes. Okay, people that have joined most recently, welcome, and thank you for joining us. If you've got questions, which we will be doing in the question section after our speakers, please post them in the chat. My colleague Ruth, who just spoke, is going to be collating these, and we'll read them out and present those questions for you later on. So please post them in the chat now. And again, please pass on my apologies to anybody that doesn't get into this meeting. If that happens, we are rather overfull. So I'll move on now to our first speaker. Parminder Singh works with IT for Change, who are based in Bangalore in India. They are pioneering in many areas of digital trade, but especially I've derived a lot of my own understanding of the kind of economic justice dimensions of digital trade from IT for Change and from Parminder. So we're delighted to have him here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm Parminder, as Laura said, and I would briefly go over issues about political economy of data, because I think we need to first go there before we come to what the trade implications of data flows are. So I'll quickly talk about what the political of data is now, how it is sustained, what we can do about it, and then place it in the trade rules environment. Now, we all hear, and economists would even talk about data being the new oil and data being the most valuable resource. And that's where the talk about economic value of data stops, because we need to then ask if data is indeed the most important resource, whose resource is it? How does the distribution of its value take place? And so on. But nobody wants to go to that area. And there's a very good reason for that, because the default is working for the most powerful, and these most powerful are the big corporations and some governments which back them. Now, how does it work for them? In the case of intellectual property, it was the big corporations who wanted law on their side to be able to ring fence what they called as their intellectual property, because ideas were out there to be shared by anyone, and they needed to stop them from being shared. But here, in case of data, it is the big corporations who collect all the data. And since they already collect the data are behind their technology walls, they do not need the help of law. So they say the default is good. Whoever collects data owns it. Now, this, I think, is the most important point. And when we talk about free flow of data in trade rules or at WTO or in bilaterals or plurilaterals, the free flow of data is basically a code word for whoever collects data owns it. And I think we need to aim at that problematic phrasing. Now, again, I would like to discuss a bit about why is data important. Now, data, people have heard that data is a bad thing to share, but you really don't get it unless you start using a different vocabulary, which IT for Change now uses, that it's not so much the data which is a problem, but the fact that somebody is collecting intelligence about you. All data is about intelligence. Data is collected for no reason other than to get intelligence about you. Things which you yourself don't know about yourself, things you don't know about your kids, your spouses, your neighborhood, is what data is about. That somebody is collecting intensive, granular, intimate intelligence about it. And I think there should be a moral right that I own intelligence about myself, or I have a right to control how intelligence about me is collected and used. And that moral philosophical right is behind what we have been talking about, collective rights over data, which again, I will also come to very, very, very quickly. So what we need to do is to claim collective rights over data. And before I go there, again, there are two fictions on which the current political economy of data survives. One fiction is consent, and other fiction is anonymization. Consent, is a blackmail, basically. Everybody standing on the road who wants to get onto an Uber will consent to practically anything. And what it does is it individualizes the relationship between the individual and the corporations, and there's no entity in between. And since I've got the consent, then I have right to do things with you. Second thing is anonymization, which is another second fiction, that moment I anonymize data, I'm free from all the privacy related rules, which are the only rules in the data space, and they no longer apply to me. Now, the problem is that fact that private data was the most important data may have been true till a few years back, but today non-personal data is almost as important as personal data, because it's non-personal data which is behind artificial intelligence. People are not interested so much just in your own life, but they are interested in patterns. People who have long hair like red cars. People who sit in couches in a certain manner do these kind of things. This is granular intelligence, which is the stock in trade of big corporations. They're interested in the patterns. If so, then so. If X, then Y. This intelligence is all built on non-personal data. But that second fiction, which says that moment we have anonymized the data, it's in no man's land. It's the Wild West. There's no law which controls the sharing of non-personal data. Now, what this has done is individualize all relationships around data and relate it only to personal human rights of the individual, which I say are very, very important. I don't want to go into it. We all agree they're important. But we do not go into economic rights over data, one. And second, collective economic rights, because most of these rights are not possible for an individual to exercise vis-a-vis a corporation. The inequality of power relationship is so huge that you will consent to everything. So we need to talk about economic rights, which Laura talked about, that IT for Change works on. And second, we talk about collective rights. So we have been working on the concept of community rights to data, that communities need to claim the data about them. If it is a city of London, the question is, the commuting patterns of London belongs to the people of London or whoever collects it in London? This is a very basic question. And whoever I talk to, generally in a moral philosophical manner, say, yes, it makes sense that people somehow own the commuting patterns of London. And that could be true of schooling patterns in London, in health patterns in London, entertainment patterns in London, or everything. So communities supposed to own collectively the data, which is the intelligence or patterns about them. And the concept of community ownership of data is important. And what we need to do as countries, as civil society activists, is to actually go out and fight and argue that we need a new set of community rights over data. And these are not typical individual property rights. We are talking about having a new commons like Eleanor Ostrom would talk about, like the physical columns of forests. Forests are not something which everybody or anybody can go and extract value out of. A local community has a right over the forest. they together decide how allocation of that resource between the community takes place. In the same way, a community whose data it is should decide the allocation of resources around the data, including its possible flow outside the country. So claiming of community right of data, and in India we are doing a lot of work, and probably very soon a report will be released in India. I'm a part of the committee which would talk about community rights to data, and that would be the first place anybody would have talked about it in that kind of authoritative manner. And I would like all activists to understand that community rights is the first thing in all of these fights. Now, what happens when we allow free flow of data? The moment the data flows outside your country, it flows outside the rule of law of your country. It flows outside the jurisdiction of your country. So you can no longer exercise not only privacy rights, which some people are saying we can have an arrangement that we can guarantee them, but you lose economic rights over those data. And unless there are international agreements which recognize the economic rights of the respective communities over data, till then, we cannot have free flow of data. I'm not against having international agreements on data. Probably WTO is not the right place for it. We should have some kind of agreements which recognize that data of London belongs to the people of London. They have a final say over it. In the same way, financial flows are allowed globally, but they're only allowed because Parminder's money is my money, even if it is in London or in Washington. And once you start understanding and accepting economic rights to data, it is possible to have international agreements. And what happens, and now slightly touching to the question of South, is that the data extractivism is highest here because South is a place which generates a lot of data, has almost no digital company, and it has become that old extractivism of natural resources, where the natural resources goes from the South. They're developed into digital intelligence services in the North, which are then again sold back to the South. And this can only be broken if not only South develops community rights over data, but also very sophisticated digital industrialization policies, which is a whole pack which we could probably somehow talk at other places. But also countries like England, countries like UK, but European countries, when they are entering their bilaterals and plurilaterals, should insist that data is a thing which is a collectively owned entity, and we cannot allow free flow of data. And if there has to be an international agreement for flows of data, it should be based on economic ownership of the respective community. And I will stop here and happy to take questions going forward. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Parminder. Yeah, that was extremely informative. I'm going to hand straight over now to our second speaker, which is Anne-Marie Naylor of Future Care Capital, which is a health innovation charity based in the UK. They have immense expertise, far beyond my beginnings of my understanding about the value that the data that we produce within the NHS, and how that is or should be being valued, and how corporations are getting involved in that. So over to you, Anne-Marie. You are, let me unmute you. There we are.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and use slides if I may. So I'll just make that possible and give you my slide deck. So can everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up, Laura. Okay. So essentially what we've got here, we wanted to talk this afternoon. Laura invited me to talk to you about a different type of data, publicly controlled personal data from a UK perspective. And so this is something that the charity I work for, Future Care Capital, has done a lot of work on over the last 3 years. And I want to take you through a quick counter of that, and then admit it from the outset that I'm not a trade specialist, and say something briefly at the end about how what I'm going to talk you through fits with the sort of 5 areas, or some of those 5 areas that Laura introduced at the top. So in the first case, just in case people aren't from a health or social care background that are listening today, it's increasingly obvious that data plays a massively important role in terms of population health, and none more so, never more so than now during the pandemic globally. And that there are clear benefits to collaborating and sharing data about, for example, trials, cases of COVID infection and so forth, and good practice internationally. So I'm not here to say that in the first instance, that sharing knowledge around the world and sharing information and intelligence is a bad thing. But what I do want to say, to set the scene, is that health data itself is not just about the clinical value to individuals or the social value to a community that might, in this instance, at present be potentially infected with the virus, but it also harbours environmental and clear economic development and commercial value. And critical in this is that there is not currently international agreement about how to convey or quantify that value, as Parminder said earlier. We're not even sure, or there's not even an agreement that that might be either feasible or desirable. So good work from the Open Data Institute about the value of data and the difficulties in quantifying that. So that means that as a result, the NHS controls vast amounts of data in the UK context. But we're not clear what the value of that data is if we're talking from a commercial value and thinking about it in the context of trade deals and negotiations. But to give some indication, so GSK paid out £300 million for 23andMe for a 4-year time-limited exclusive access to genetic data back in 2018, and Roche acquired Flatiron Health about 1.9 billion. So we're not talking small sums of money. And last year, Ernst & Young estimated that the NHS data could generate £10 billion per annum in a combination of revenue and efficiency savings. It's fair to say that other large accounting firms, as Parminder alluded to, suggested that there was no value in the same data set. As when I say contested, it's literally from 0 to 10 billion and anywhere in between. So to give someone an indication, at the moment we need £12 billion in the UK per annum, estimated by the Health Foundation and King's Fund and others, in order to properly sustain our social care system for people who are disabled and elderly or in require of support in the community. So instead of raising taxes, we might proactively develop a strategy to realise that £10 billion in a collectively beneficial manner, not least in consideration of the very likely tax rises we're going to see over the years to come to pay for the current period. But all that is going on in the context of what was already a very complex landscape, legal and regulatory. So it's not fair to say that it's very straightforward to access health data for the purposes of research or innovation or service provision. And that in itself is complicated further because we're in a transition year as a result of Brexit, which leaves us in something of a hiatus. And yet we are negotiating trade agreements in that period of hiatus, as well as against the backdrop of the pandemic. That gives you sort of the backdrop. And to give you some indication, people may be au fait with the kind of data protection regs that are in place in the UK. Like much of Europe, we imported GDPR into our own Data Protection Act in 2018. But there are a number of other key acts that govern data protection in particular. And rather less is there about the research and commercial usage of healthcare data in practice. So much of the legislation and regulation is geared towards the protection of individuals, and as Parminder said again, not to the protection of collectives in the face of research and commercial interest. We've produced a document there on the right with Anthony Collins Solicitors, which is freely available on our website. It's a lengthy tome of 75 pages that takes you on a canter through every legal aspect of the research and commercial use of healthcare data in the UK, if you should feel inclined. But to give you a sense, in addition to that, there are 3 types of policy and regulations sort of out there right now that we need to think about when we're thinking about trade deals and digital. So there are a number of policies like the National Data Opt-out policy that allow you to some extent ordinarily to opt out of your health data being used for various things. We have a dedicated National Data Guardian for health and social care data that holds the government to account, put on a statutory basis only recently. There are lots of local information governance advice guidance developed by health services and social care services and local government. And there is a standard national data protection security toolkit to make sure that cybersecurity is locked into the sort of use of healthcare data and its stewardship within the UK. But there are also rather fewer, but also key provisions about offshoring existing health data. So it's already permissible to do that with NHS data if you are working with the EEA countries, EU, or the US, where it's covered by the Privacy Shield. And I think what's important is in the last 12 months, a great deal of legislation or statutory instruments more readily have been passed very quickly. The one that's noted in the centre of the slide, the Data Protection, Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, was passed last year, I think in about 12 minutes with very little debate. And that affords rather sweeping powers, not to the Secretary of State for Health, but the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sports, to, on the 1st of January next year, post-Brexit, to declare various places, territories and sectors adequate so that they would also be brought in the offshoring rules. So it's clear that things can change very quickly in terms of where the data might flow that we currently house in the UK or in European context. And at the same time, currently in Parliament yesterday and tomorrow, the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill is being debated in committee. This is to bring in European legislation or powers, repatriate powers, for us to control the regulation of invasive kind of medical devices. But they also cover software, and it's not clear yet the extent to which they might cover data-driven algorithms and other such in that bill. Certainly an issue that's been raised by parliamentarians in previous rounds of discussions in Parliament. So there again, we have something else, but it's clear that the Medicines and Medical Device Bill is there to protect patient safety and ensure we don't put devices into people that have adverse consequences. But it's also clear that the bill is very explicit about wishing to make the United Kingdom a place that is very attractive to develop medicines and medical devices in. So it's there very much as the beginning foray, really, to say how we will regulate these things and how we'd welcome people to use data to develop the treatments and technologies of tomorrow. And then the last piece there's two notions there which are for techies really on this subject, but basically just to say that during the pandemic, none of the things I've just said really applies. So at the moment, there are special emergency powers in place, a 300-page act or more for coronavirus provisions across the piece in government, but there are also data provisions that have come in emergency fashion, which allow the Secretary of State for Health to require and request health data from myriad organisations at the local level to send it central, so they can understand how the health system is working in the round and where virus outbreaks are, whether there's enough ventilators in the right place and so forth. This is the first 360-degree view of the health service digitally, and I would very much doubt that would be relinquished post the emergency period, if not in part, certainly not in full. So just to give an inclination, this is how complicated it is. So it's not easy to get health data if you are an entrepreneur in another country thinking about this from the point of view of trade deals. There are around about 100,000 different data controllers in the health landscape in England. And many of these in and of themselves then have hundreds, if not thousands, of data sets that don't link and talk to one another within them. So we're not over-egging here the extent to which it's easy. But what I want to say is that the focus in all of the provisions to date has been on the data and not on the intellectual property that is given rise to by that usage and access to that data. So there are a number of things that guide this. So the Life Science Industrial Strategy 3 years ago made plain that the NHS harbours the potential to develop a great many treatments and technologies of the future and should be approached as such. Since then, Treasury and others have put forward sort of the kind of studies that they want to look at how to value the data so we can put a figure on it, but they've not been published or completed. And we've also seen endless delays to the National Data Strategy, such that we are now negotiating trade agreements without an overarching national framework. We undertook a piece of work, which is top right, that taking next steps to harness the value of health and care data research to look at demand for healthcare data. And it was mostly from higher education institutions and pharmaceutical companies at the time. We can't believe that there isn't technological company interest also, but we haven't been able to find it because there isn't a requirement of local NHS organisations to record those requests and to report them in a standardised manner to the centre. So we're pleased that the government is setting up a legal and commercial centre of expertise in NHSX, which will provide notionally a transparent list of requests for that data and the deals that have been entered into in due course. But clearly we're negotiating before that's in place. So hard to tell who's doing it at the moment or who's interested. What we've got is a code of conduct for data-driven health and care technology at the moment, and that is pretty much the only sort of restriction, as it were, or framework for restrictions around the use of health data in the UK context for the development of intellectual property. It's got 10 guiding principles. The 10th is about commercial exploitation. It's important to acknowledge that that code of conduct is not mandatory. So it does not have any statutory force and may or may not be treated as significant by industries and nations negotiating with us at this time. And then the last piece to flag is just to say in terms of intellectual property, there's also economic development value. So how many businesses there might flow from the AI revolution, and that could be homegrown were we not to offshore or outsource or allow the free flow of data, health data to other countries in quite so straightforward a manner. And Manufacturing the Future talks about whether or not there are whole industries that could be cited in the UK that can make use of that data to create jobs and employment opportunities. So where does that leave us? So top right, this was announced this morning. So the Secretary of State talked about the fact we are now beginning to negotiate with Australia and New Zealand a new trade agreement, and made very clear that the NHS is not on the table. but did not mention the data that the NHS controls. So again, it's absent because there's silence in relation to it. On the left, we've got the four out of the 5 points that Laura raised at the top of the webinar. So in terms of mandatory cross-border data flows, I think it's important to ask whether or not we want the same treatment of public and private sector data controllers in trade deals, and whether there's a carve-out for what is a uniquely single-payer health system with access to longitudinal data that doesn't exist elsewhere. Acknowledging at the same time, however, that that data needs a significant investment if it is to be cleaned up, linked and standardized in a way that is most readily usable for the purposes of artificial intelligence, machine learning and so forth. Do we then want to talk about health data sovereignty? Is this about, as China has in place and a number of other countries, do we want to allow our genetic information out of the country? Is there a national security risk? Are there certain weapons that could be developed in the future using that would be particularly noxious? What also of our carbon commitment? So it's clear that the storage of data is rather light touch, even though there's a lot of health data in the NHS, but the processing of large imaging data sets and in particular genetic data creates huge amounts of, well, requires huge amounts of electricity. If we offshore that, should we be attaching carbon requirements to it so that we don't effectively walk around our Paris Climate Agreement kind of commitments? In terms of banning on local data processing and storage, I think we need to ask the question of health data, whether or not we're talking about life-critical infrastructure. We've realised in recent weeks to a significant cost in the United Kingdom, that despite our best efforts to raise a profile of the need to have better understanding and data about social care provision for vulnerable and elderly people in the United Kingdom, we didn't have that when the pandemic hit. We still don't have that. And that has cost lives rather than saved it in the way that we would hope to use this kind of data ordinarily. Do we want to offshore data that might be life critical? Do we equally want to, then in terms of source code and algorithmic secrecy, how will we regulate the treatments and technologies of the future if we can't test them? So again, the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill is very live and current now, and that asks some of these questions, but already FDA and others are requiring access to data that we have in order to regulate products we send and export to the US. Should we do the same? To what extent? In what ways? Are we concerned about automated decision-making in health service provision? So for example, are we concerned that we might train algorithms and export them to the global south and do damage to communities because the data set on which they're trained is biased towards the UK population? Or vice versa, are we concerned that we might in future see in an automated nightmare that ambulances are not dispatched anymore by people, but are dispatched and triaged by machine? And if ambulances are operating that way from California and we can't see into the black box, will a different set of values that attach to their kind of view of the world in the US of healthcare and how it should be approached financially and from the point of view of risk pooling or not more readily, will that actually impact the way in which decisions are making about access to treatment if they're automated and we can't see? And then the final one is just to say on the tariff ban on digital products, the vehicle that we have long since advocated for is a sovereign health fund. And we've talked about being transparent in a radical way at national level about any revenue that is generated by data, the access to health data in the United Kingdom, and ensuring that that is invested in lower risk enterprises and investments for the long term so that it returns money to the National Health Service or to health and social care to improve its sustainability in the future. So that's all I have to say to you, and I think I have to do something now, Wizzy, about sharing my screen back. I will stop. There you go.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. That was, again, a flood of useful information that I need to go away and think about for a long time. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth now, who has been collecting your questions through the chat. If you've got further questions, please continue to post them, and if we get time, she will pose those as well. So Ruth, over to you.
Great, thanks. So we don't have loads of questions, so do keep putting your questions up as the discussion goes along, and we'll try and notice if you have a question relevant to the thing we're talking about at that point. I'll try and make sure we pick it up as we go along. So I think the first, there's a mixture of questions and comments, so I think I'll just read them out maybe in the order of presentations. So from Laura's presentation, Richard Hill kind of wants to emphasize that the key point is the free flow of data is to the advantage of Google, Facebook and the other big tech companies. And while a ban on data localization would favor efficiency, it might hinder equity in public policy. So he's saying the key point is, how can national laws be enforced without a local presence? The rule on no source code disclosure could, depending on how it's interpreted, prevent governments from procuring open source software. If a tariff ban's good for a developing country, then it will adopt it voluntarily, which I think some of us would have doubts about, and maybe Laura could hand over to you to talk about that a bit more. There's no justification for a tariff ban being imposed by developed countries. So Laura, that was kind of in response to what you were saying. So do you want to take that question, but maybe others have other thoughts on those comments?
Yeah, well, just on tariffs, I think the point being made there was that if it was beneficial for instance, a developing country to not charge tariffs on electronic transmissions, there's nothing stopping them already from not charging tariffs. There doesn't need to be a global ban on them charging tariffs to allow them to make that choice. So I think people that oppose this ban, what we're trying to do through that is to open up the policy space and make it open for individual countries to make the decisions for themselves about, you know, which tariffs they want to charge, and, you know, whether charging tariffs on electronic transmissions might be a good idea for them. So this is really about policy space and local decision making.
Would you like to respond at all to any of the points?
Ruth, did you ask me, Parminder, here?
Yeah. Did you want to respond to any of the points? That,
also the ones you spoke, but some of them are appearing here. One is that should I?
Sorry, Parminder. All of the comments and questions I'm collecting, and I'm going through them. So if you want to just take the one that I was talking about just now, we'll go through the other ones as we go along. Okay. So no, anything you think among your questions was specific to me, I'll take it, but then otherwise I'll pass. Okay. Anne-Marie, anything you wanted to add to the points that Richard was raising?
No, I think they're most relevant to Laura's presentation at the top.
Great. So we have quite a lot of questions then specifically from Parminder's presentation. So from James H, who I think is probably James Harrison from Warwick University, asking, really interested in why developing countries will lose so much more in terms of reduced revenue from tariffs compared with developing countries, if I've got that right. Could you say a bit more of that, about that, and is there a good source for that information?
Sorry, Ruth, did you ask me this question?
Yeah.
Can you please repeat it? I missed the question.
So it's a question about why developing countries would lose more in terms of reduced tariff revenue compared with developed countries, and whether there's a good source for that information.
Yeah, so I didn't really speak about tariff revenue. I think it's much more. It's basically an extractivism of the kind where industrial value chains in the colonial era operated, where the natural resources were taken from the developing countries, and finished products were made in the developed countries and sold back to the markets in developing countries. The digital economy is functioning in the same manner, where the data as a raw material is taken from developing countries. They're changed into intelligent services in developed countries, whether it's a Facebook or a Twitter or a Google service, and then sold back at a huge price back. And this is the extractivism which is problematic. Tariff-wise, yes, also, and this was a question Laura was talking in her slide, that there's a huge amount of loss of tariff due to there's being a moratorium on e-transmissions, which UNCTAD has been studied, but which is a sub-issue of what I have been talking about.
I'm happy to chip in on that question about the tariff revenues. So the reason why developing countries lose so much more is because predominantly because developing countries tend to charge higher tariffs. So the source for the data was from UNCTAD. I can share the report in the email I send after this call. But predominantly they looked at the average tariff charged by each country and then applied that to their electronic transmissions imports. The other reason why it's developing countries that lose out much more is that they tend to be net importers of electronic transmissions, whereas, you know, some richer countries, especially the US, are net exporters. So they kind of win in a tariff-free game whereas developing countries tend to lose out.
Great, thanks. I hope that answers the questions. I'm following the chat as well as I can to pick up on any follow-up questions. But I'll move to some questions for Anne-Marie. There's quite a lot of questions about the interaction between data and things like GDPR rules and the value of the data that the NHS is creating. So I'll maybe try and put them together. So Catherine Makin asks, what bearing does legislation such as GDPR have on the trade of data? So it's a European regulation but has global application. So do other equivalent regulations exist in other continents? And kind of related to that, there are questions about an estimate. So there's quite a big focus on NHS data, but is there an estimate of privately held data and whether that's ever shared with citizens? And kind of again related to that, how the public approval of the commercial companies, so the companies that are holding that data, paves the way for future relationships. So Patty Rundle, who's from Baby Milk Actions, asking, Danone secured a partnership with the FAO, for example, based on, I assume Patty means kind of their ability to collect and use a large amount of data. And then again, is there a data sharing framework, principles, or any legal principle that allows the NHS to do that sharing with big tech, or is it just kind of within the domain of its partnerships?
Okay, so I'll take them in order of ease, not in order that you asked them. Prerogative. So basically, in terms of the framework, yes. So there are, the framework, I've popped a note and a link to it in the chat for everybody. That's the Code of Conduct for Data-Driven Technology in Health and Care. And as I said during the presentation, the challenge with that is that it's not mandatory. It is a voluntary code, and there are not currently significant sanctions, or at least ones we can discern from the overall framework, and has been updated for almost 12 months now. So obviously these things change very quickly. I think the challenge I would absolutely throw out, having done it already in public forum in the last 7 days with a former minister next to me, is to say that I don't think currently the government is necessarily in compliance with its own code of conduct at national level in the way that it is entering into deals with technology companies using data for the purposes of managing the pandemic. So I can hardly see it leading by example and others following suit. Although I know from working with people on the ground in the NHS that they're very much determined to try, and the question is very complicated. How do they do it when they don't have necessarily the expertise to deal with significantly powerful lawyers and others from large corporates? In terms of GDPR, yes, of course, GDPR has been imported into UK law, lock, stock and barrel, but not. So there are there's great wiggle room in there for us to make our own kind of rules up on certain aspects of GDPR. And I think it's fair to say that we can also, for example, with adequacy, move away quite quickly in the context of trade deals to declare tomorrow California and the health sector and Google adequate for everything, and send everything there if we say, well, not if we wish, but if the Secretary of State for DCMS wishes. And I think that's the thing that most people are not necessarily aware of, is that those powers are out with the data protection rules. They are statutory instruments that were passed very quickly and little seen and noticed. But they do give massive powers to the government to change the way it approaches data. And I know that clearly it wants to obviously make a pitch for increasing amounts. If we look at the Department for Business, it's set up 5 themed groups to think about the recovery and to think about next steps. And one of those is about leveraging and attracting significant amounts of inward investment for the purposes of matching funding, public investment in R&D going forward. So there is another way in which we're seeking to get money in order to clean up and curate the data that's already there, in order to make it the raw material more attractive. So polish the shop window, as it were. So I think all of these things are happening at the same time as the framework around IP and protections to safeguard that value. You can neither say what the value is, nor how to safeguard it with anything that's statutory and mandatory. So you just got to assume that it will leak, and we can't even tell at the moment. So I think the first step is to say we demand transparency before anyone puts that in the context of a trade negotiation. In terms of Peter's question about private sector data and estimates of its value, I haven't seen one. I've obviously focused on health and social care. I think it's fair to say that we've worked with a number of organisations who do this for a living, and they can quite clearly put a value on their data holdings. So it's not that it can't be done and there isn't a value. I would say that it is difficult for public sector controlled data sets. It's not the same trade-off, because you want public goods as well as commercial goods, and is a more narrow focus on the part of corporates. And I don't know of any data cooperatives that are functioning and distributing large sums of monies, although that was where I came into this debate originally and looked at whether or not there is one in Switzerland called mydata.coop. It's MI Data, and they didn't give you money back for your data. They gave you research about the medical conditions that were affecting you as a payback. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thanks. And there are just two quick follow-up questions on the same theme. So Ron from Bristol Protect Our NHS asks, what potential value does personal health data have for private firms bidding for NHS contracts? And Pauline Roche asks, who should community reps, so I think this is a question from a union rep, so who should reps be raising the question of ownership of or trading of NHS data with?
Okay.
I saw Pauline shake her head, so possibly not a union rep, maybe more broader community representatives.
So, I mean, there are various patient structures, but they're set up to improve the quality of care rather than for you to have your say about the way in which the machine crunches money and generates outcomes. I think at the moment the challenge is, I think that the intention is that the code of conduct should be more, the board of an NHS trust should become more accountable to it, but there are currently no sanctions. So having met a number of people that represent such boards, the reply came, well, can they be fired? Can anybody be fired? They've got massive budget problems. This isn't going to be top of their list. So again, without making it mandatory with sanctions, we haven't got a lot to do there in point of fact. But I think writing to the National Data Guardian, involving yourself in the work of understanding patient data, which the Wellcome Trust, encourages engagement and champions transparency on that basis. In terms of the value to private sector companies that might use already or bid for contracts, absolutely. The Taking Next Steps document I mentioned earlier, everybody read the first chapter, and then it was like the difficult second album, part B. Nobody read it. It's terribly difficult because it's not about sexy patient data that results in wonderful whiz-bang treatments and technologies. It's about the administrative or operational data within the NHS system, which is vast. So the stuff that basically we know about the hospital building, the emissions coming from the NHS estate, the amount of journeys and carbon generated by poorly managed appointments, and so forth. There's tremendous value in that data, and it must be valuable because it is not controlled or readily accessible by the NHS. It remains already in the hands of those people who have, to whom those services for managing those buildings and appointments have been outsourced. So one of the recommendations we've made is that all procurement should reach in and bring that data back as first thing that it should do, because not least it means that people who have already got a monopoly on, for example, how to build a hospital efficiently or manage its electricity supply efficiently, means other people can't compete against them. So it means procurement in the round is inefficient.
Could I just chip in on that last question about how valuable is this to private companies, which was just that I found out yesterday that one of the companies that's involved in processing COVID-19 related data in the UK, it's called Palantir. It's set up by a Donald Trump ally, linked to Cambridge Analytica, considered highly controversial. They've taken on a contract to manage a lot of data for the princely sum of £1 is what they will be paid for this contract, despite having salary costs of £88,000 a week. So I find it hard to believe that a Trump ally would be doing this out of the goodness of their heart. So that's possibly an indication of just how valuable these this access to data and to the intellectual property that can be derived from it might be.
Great, thanks. I've got a few more questions from Parminder, kind of a group of questions around community ownership of data. So questions are kind of framed around wanting a bit more explanation about how the concept of community ownership of data might work in practice. So the Nashiket who asked the questions, talking about the Zoom call that we're on now. So how might the data generated from something like this be owned by the community on the call, and how do you then kind of share the benefits of that? follow-up question, is there a country that already recognised community rights over data? Is there a kind of blueprint or a good practice example that we could follow? And finally then, how do you talk to communities, particularly in the global south, or where there's no data privacy or data privacy regulations, to help them understand economic rights to data? Are there examples of campaigns along those lines that already exist?
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks for the questions. I think it's first thing is important. Like, for example, Annie Mary was talking about, there are a lot of initiatives which use individual data and probably give you back something, whether money or some other thing like my data. But as we have been talking, we are talking about collective data. And in a recent work for Public Service International, we have developed practical possibilities how it can work. One of the possibilities, for example, is that Uber drivers can insist that it is data given from the Uber cars which actually contributes to most of the value of the Uber corporation, and they collectively own it. Now, if we look at an individual owner, an Uber driver is in no position to negotiate with the Uber corporation. They simply say, do you want to be on the network or not? But if all Uber drivers together collectively own the data which is generated by their cars, which is what Uber really works on and is their main asset, then they probably can share co-ownership, they can share decision-making powers in the board. And these are some somewhat radical looking ideas which we are saying. The earlier industrial age labor struggles were built on a different plank, but here the ownership of data, collective ownership of the data by the workers, by Uber, etc., is what I think is the point going forward. And it is possible if the law allows you to claim as a community collective ownership over the data which Uber drivers produce, or workers on a data-fied manufacturing plant produce, and say, this is the data which I contributed to the work process. I have a right, therefore, to be into the decision-making processes of the system. Then there was a question of how that benefit is shared. And in this case, I think we need to agree that the benefit sharing of the collective kind, which I talked about in Uber or workers case, is much more useful. But also in the case of New Delhi commuting data, if the commuting data, which is with Uber or Google, is actually owned by the people of New Delhi, then people of New Delhi through any collective organization or a farmer cooperative through a collective organization have a right to say that Monsanto can use the data only in this manner and not in this manner, and the data ownership is with the farmers cooperative. But all these things have to be backed by law, which is the main thing I keep on saying. Question of Vahini, right now India has started to use the term community data in its policy documents, but very soon it could be anytime there would be a report of government experts on community data, which would be very useful and would do much pioneering work in this area, and which we hope others can comment on, of course, and part of it can also be adopted. Last question is, how do you talk to people who don't even know about privacy? I think without sounding harsh, it is a very paternalistic question. In 1950, when we adopted the Constitution of India, we could have as well have said, how would you talk all these big things about fundamental rights to a country where 80% people are illiterate? It doesn't work like that. You have to claim rights for the people. And then people, I work with traders, I work with farmer groups, I work with Uber drivers, I work with domestic workers. Everybody, when you explain to them that they own the data about their work, they really do understand. So let's accept that people are ready to understand their economic rights. And nothing is much more better understood by people who may be in poverty as they understand economic rights, perhaps even more than privacy, which I don't want to really otherwise say. So let's not say that it's difficult and therefore can't be done. This is what we need to do. We need to make collective claims on our data in a legal basis, and then use that legal basis to practical purposes, which I have been discussing. Thank you, Ruth.
Great, thanks. So I have a question from Kira and Patty, just to ask whether there's a good source for modelling the emissions impacts of data storage, and somewhere that gives an indication of the size or types of data that might be stored in this way. So I think that's, Anne-Marie, that's a follow-up to your question, to your point about NHS imaging data and so on.
Oh, you muted again, Anne-Marie. Sorry, I don't know how that's happened.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so in terms of the modelling, I don't know is the answer, but what I can tell you is this, that the person that I've been talking to most recently thinks that if you were to create 6 data centres to host roughly what the NHS and like data set might look like if you looked at it as one thing, which is not the case, you need about 2 million cores to process it. And that would result in sort of needing about, it's 40 megawatts ago, so 40,000 kilowatt. Well, you turn it into kilowatt hours, so you've got about somewhere between 350,000 tons of carbon per annum, or something to that effect, by my rough calculation from the 6 data stores. But that needs checking and verifying, and it's something that we want to do more work on over the coming months. So if people are interested in that, please do get in touch, especially if you've got any expertise or prowess in there or experience from elsewhere. Actually meeting Laura and coming to talk to you today prompted us to think very carefully about where all the kind of upsides and downsides to potential trade deals where NHS data is concerned implied, and we think that this is a really important angle that's not really been investigated properly yet.
Great. I think we're going to have to wrap up and leave it there because we are at the end of our session. Thank you so much to Ruth for chairing that. I would have sincerely struggled to keep on top of all the questions coming in while everything else is going on. Thank you to our fantastic speakers. There's so much more to say, and I hope that we can come together again sometime and press this in even more depth. But it's been a fantastic introduction to the issues, and I hope that yeah, thank you to everybody that has come to join us. I hope that everybody has found something in this session that feels relevant to your area of work. Certainly once I started digging into this issue, I realised this touched on so many aspects of life and of justice and fairness than I would ever have imagined such a geeky sounding issue to touch. So yeah, it would be great to stay in touch and to maintain this momentum and to keep a lot more people working on digital trade. I'm going to send an email following up this call, which will mention 2 email lists, one that's international and one that's more UK focused, and which you'd be very welcome to join if you want to stay more in touch with this work. And we'll also share the slides and a few other references to further information. Yeah, and finally, the Trade Justice Movement is about to publish a paper that will that covers a full look at digital trade and its likely impact, and will touch very significantly on this economic justice angle. So that should be coming forward in the next few months. So do keep an eye out for that as well. So that's everything, I think. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope we can stay in touch and talk more about this in the future. So take care. Have a very fine day.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks.